2021, we thought was going to be way different than 2020. But as we've seen, especially in the US last week, the world was absolutely shocked by what happened in Washington, D.C., with the far right storming the Capitol, Trump supporting, holding all of these flags, breaking windows, breaking into buildings. We saw reports of panic buttons being ripped out of the walls and in certain Congress people's offices. Although Trump lost in November, we know that Trumpism itself and the forces of the far right are likely to grow actually under Biden. So I want to welcome Keely and start off with my first question, Keely. Can you just kind of give our viewers an overview of what happened during this chaos in the US Capitol, like who organized it and what were their goals? What were they trying to achieve?
Yeah, so I mean, it was just absolute madness. I think for a lot of us, like there was, some level of expectation that this whole battle around Stop the Steal wasn't over, but it wasn't really clear like what this sort of next step was for this sort of nebulous right populist, Trumper milieu, but also the far right in particular. And so it all started on January the 6th with I think it was called like Save America rally that Trump led off, where he gave I think 79-minute speech, which is really quite impressive to be able to speak just off the cuff for that long. And at the end of it, he basically directs people to march down Pennsylvania Avenue and leads a march to the Capitol. Well, he says he's going to lead it, but he actually dips out and leaves, and then sort of unleashes this crowd of what looked like, over 10,000 people marching on the Capitol. And then the actual siege was, a certain more hardened section of the broader group that was actually present at the Capitol that day, where sort of our tensions were mounting for hours of people sort of inching closer and closer. And then these sort of patchwork of far right groups, including the Proud Boys and the 3%ers and some QAnon people, stormed the actual Capitol. And interestingly, their target, you would assume, okay, their target, if these people are Trumpers, their target must be Democrats, but that's not the case. Their target was Republicans, and their target was, what they call Republican in name only, Rhino, and people like Mike Pence. They built a noose outside that was for Mike Pence, saying, you've abandoned our movement, you've abandoned Trump, and so they basically held court in the capital of the U.S. for a number of hours until finally the National Guard came in and sort of the police were able to slowly get them out, but they really just meandered through the halls of Congress for hours. I think one guy defecated on Nancy Pelosi's desk, which is an interesting tactic.
Interesting to say the least. I mean, Nancy Pelosi's not my favorite gal, but I don't know about that tactic. It's a little strange. But I mean, thinking about the tactics of the far right, having this huge protest turned riot. I mean, 2020, we saw the largest protest movement in the US in our history, and it was overwhelmingly peaceful, as we know. I know Keely participated in it. I participated in it. And the violence that happened was mostly agitational on the wrong side, the police bringing in the violence, but we didn't see that with these far right protesters. What we saw was actually a lack of police intervention. I mean, I even saw videos, Keely, of police opening gates and letting people in. The National Guard did not get called immediately, even though they knew that these protests were going to be happening. Whereas, in Minneapolis, we see people getting shot with rubber bullets standing on their porches just for looking at the protests. So can you talk a little bit about the differences between the reaction by the police and armed forces in the far right versus the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, so I was in Brooklyn during the Black Lives Matter rebellion over the summer, and I saw, huge NYPD vans actually ram through protesters and run them over, and people getting tear gassed and, rubber bullets flying, people getting tackled. And this was a very different scene with You're exactly right, Toya. People opening, Capitol police officers opening the gates. There was even a video of someone filmed from inside the Capitol building of this guy, this white supremacist, we would assume, like literally standing at the front door going, "Can you open it?" And then some guy like walks over and opens the door. I mean, it's like that's the level of collusion that was happening. And so I think that there's sort of this sense on the left of like trying to explain what why there was this difference in approach. And there's, some liberals that are saying, oh, well, it's white privilege. It's because this group was overwhelmingly white. And I think it's important that we clarify that that's not what this was about. This is much worse than white privilege. These are actually white supremacists. And it's not because they're necessarily the race of the crowd, though I'm sure in some instances that played a role. It's because there's ideological agreement from sections of the Capitol Police and these protesters. And beyond just sort of passive agreement, it actually seems like there was likely, coordination leading up to it. From some section of the Capitol Police, there were certainly, plainclothes officers that were there, maybe off the clock, but certainly off the clock. They're coming from other states that are now, being found out as having participated in the riots. And so what this points to is the allegiance of a certain section of the state apparatus, and that is this is not an accidental thing. This has been a campaign within police forces in the U.S. for years of actually recruiting out and out, extremely far right white supremacist groups to basically infiltrate police forces. And so in the US and Socialist Alternative, what we're calling for is purges of police forces. Anyone with any ties to, neo-Nazi, white supremacist organizations, or even people with a history of racist violence should be purged from the state forces. And this is obviously, not at all I was gonna say a rubber bullet, a silver bullet to solve this level of ideological collusion, but it's a starting point.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point when we talk about this, because it's really easy, like you said, to dismiss it as just like a race war, but it's not. There's like actual ideological differences in both of these, and both of these groups are kind of working together. But it's also important that we talk about kind of, the way I think the establishment generally, but also the public, I suppose, wasn't in these protests, approaches Trump. And I think one of the main things that we've seen in the last couple of weeks was Trump being banned from Twitter and basically any other social media network on the planet. And I think it's also, we've seen a lot of people that are close to him kind of breaking ranks and moving away from him and kind of trying to distance themselves from him. And I think it's obviously relieving to a lot of people that this is it. It feels like, kind of the end of Trumpism, but is it really, do you think this is the end now? And like kind of the things that were happening in DC and the way that he's reacted to it is now going to completely stop the far right and Trumpism?
It would be really convenient if that was how the far right was defeated, if all it took was, the click of a couple of buttons. And unfortunately, that's not at all the case. I mean, I sympathize with, loads of people who've had to tune out the news over the past year and who've had to just basically, put blinders on social media to not see just some of the absolute madness that's happening. And so, yeah, there's loads of people that are happy that Trump has been kicked off of Twitter. But I think it's really important that we're crystal clear about what direction this points in for big tech to basically have the ability, they have essentially a monopoly on like casual communication for people, and to have a monopoly over, who is or who isn't able to be heard. And that today it's Trump, but Socialist Alternative in New York City also had our account banned when we were criticizing New York City landlords. And we need to be crystal clear that this is not limited to fighting the far right. They're going to use these exact same tools against the left. And so things like Twitter bans, and like censorship in that form, isn't really the right tactic to fight the right, because a lot of the sort of most hardened fringe elements actually see that as a badge of honor. They hate big tech. So they see, oh, I had 20 Facebook accounts and all of them have been kicked off Facebook. That's an honorable thing for me. I'm such a danger. And so, a strategy that's actually going to be able to defeat the right requires the left getting organized as a counterweight to these people. And that's not something that's achieved by bans like this. And I think in the US right now, there is a lot of what we would call proxy consciousness, people feeling like someone else is dealing with this crisis, someone else is handling it. And right now it's a lot of let the state sort it out. Let the state figure out how to handle getting rid of these people, silencing these people. We don't really need to do anything ourselves. And unfortunately, that's really not at all what's required to defeat this.
I think I really agree with this. And I think the point that you made about big tech, I think a lot of people have started to I think a lot of people found it very relieving that they don't have to listen to Trump go on and on and on anymore, at least so in the same way that he has before. And especially I think he was particularly, different and unique in the way that he was using social media to kind of gather his support. But at the same time, I think a lot of people are kind of thinking, hold on, if big tech can do this to Trump, they can do it to anyone. And I think that this kind of connects to the point that we always make about the state and the power of the state and how we can't, trust the state with even if they're making a step that is maybe good. They're not doing it for the benefit of working class people. They're not doing it for the benefit of us. They're doing it for their own benefit. And I think also talking about the kind of strength and the power that big tech and social media companies generally have, and the way that they can impact actual politics and impact actual people, and kind of the way that they push certain messages when it suits them, but then also do the opposite when it doesn't, is really important. And I think that what you were saying about kind of organizing the left, I wanted to ask you, because obviously in the US, I think the biggest kind of mainstream resistance to Trump is the Democrats. And I wanted to know where's the Democratic Party been through all of this? I think we've seen a lot of maybe left Democrats like AOC and generally the Squad calling for Trump's impeachment, and there's been all the voting about it. But do you think that that's an effective strategy? Is that what you mean by saying the left should organize, or is there something else that we need to be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the Democratic establishment is doing exactly what we would predict that they would do. It's what they've done all the 4 years that Trump's been in office. It's sort of legalistic, wonky means of trying to throw Trump off course. And so we saw this with the Russiagate over the first couple of years of his presidency, then the whole Ukraine fiasco and the first round of impeachment, and, taking up the second round of impeachment. It's not a surprise that that's what the Democratic establishment is doing. And that's fine. I mean, a lot of people are really happy to see Trump impeached a second time. But it's not, it's really symbolic. It's not the most concrete form of resistance, because impeachment in itself doesn't really achieve any of the aims that convicting him in the Senate would or something. But even if this goes to a trial in the Senate, he's now been impeached. And so now the next step is okay, does it go to the Senate? And even in the Senate, it's not guaranteed that they're going to be able to convict him, that they're going to be able to prevent him from running for office in 2024. It's really possible that this is the end of the road for this process and nothing is achieved. And what's been really disappointing, I think, for a lot of people in the US who look to AOC and look to Bernie Sanders, is that they have taken an approach that's basically indistinguishable from Nancy Pelosi. If you were to remove the names and put AOC's tweets next to, I don't know if Chuck Schumer tweets, but next to Chuck Schumer's transcript of him talking, you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell the difference. And that's really an abdication of the moment. And so what the squad's done is basically since Wednesday, they scrambled to draft these articles of impeachment, which were identical to the articles of impeachment drafted by, establishment representatives in the House. And so they've not called for mass demonstrations. They've not called for any sort of organization on the left. They've not even symbolically pointed to the role of a mass movement in defeating the far right. And that's really quite disappointing. And I think that a lot of the reason we haven't seen mass demonstrations in the US against this, counter protests like you would have seen in Boston in 2017, is partially because of the lack of leadership on the left and people not really feeling like there's anything that they can do, that they can affect the situation. And a lot of the responsibility for that and a lot of the feeding into this proxy consciousness, let the state sort it out, is precisely the role of these progressives in Congress.
Yeah, Keely, thanks so much. This has been such a great discussion. I mean, this for me I'm still working through the pandemic, is one of the most politicizing times I've seen at my workplace since the Me Too movement, to be honest. Even more political discussions are happening about what needs to be done to stop Trump and stop the far right than we had during even the Black Lives Matter movement. But I watched one of your speeches that you gave recently in New York, and I thought you put it so well. I encourage people to check out the New York City Socialist Alternative Facebook page, where you said, impeaching Trump is a side dish. It's not the main course. And I've been talking to people about this idea, and I think you put it so perfectly, because it's like, yes, we want to make sure he can't run again. Of course, we don't want to see another Trump, but like, what are we going to do to stop this whole right-wing movement? Trumpism is not dead, whether Trump, is impeached or can't run again or whatever. But now the situation we're coming into is Biden is going to be inaugurated on January 20th, which is just a few short days away. But we have to continue to fight, as we've discussed here. So what is Socialist Alternative calling for people to do? What is needed, for the next 4 years under a Democratic White House to stop the far right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can take the story in two parts a little bit. We've got the next week before inauguration, where the far right is planning an escalation. I mean, of course, they have such conflicting outlooks on how to achieve change. There's some elements of the far right that think they can still stop Biden's inauguration. They can still win another 4 years of Trump. And then there's some that are a bit more in touch with reality, who've accepted that Biden will take office, but they're working on their long-term strategy, and their sights are set on 2022 when they're planning to primary all of these Republicans and basically start to lay the basis for a far right party in the United States outside of the Republican Party. And that same level of organization is needed on the left. I mean, that same level and far more is needed on the left. And that's, that we're not necessarily seeing that at this stage. And so in the next week, Socialist Alternative is calling for demonstrations against, if the far right continues this assault, for continued demonstrations to shut them down. But that we can't stop there, because the only thing that can undercut the right is a left-wing program that can unite the widest possible section of the working class. And so we're, pointing to the role of AOC in the squad, and also big organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America in building that pole of attraction for working class people, some sort of an organization or some sort of a struggle that fights for Medicare for all, for, it looks like we're going to get the $2,000 stimulus checks. We can't stop there. We need rent cancellation. It looks like, Biden's planning to create whatever, a $15 an hour minimum wage. Okay, so what's our next demand based on that? How do we build off of that? And that's, so what we're calling for is a continued struggle for desperately needed relief for working people over the next 2 years. The Democrats don't have an excuse anymore. There's no Republican boogeyman that they can point to say, well, look, Mitch McConnell is holding us up and there's nothing we can do. The floor is theirs to do what they need to do. And so a huge amount of pressure is going to have to be brought to bear on them to actually follow through with these promises. They are diametrically opposed to Medicare for all in the middle of a public health crisis. And unfortunately, with the whole force the vote debate on the left, the squad is too afraid to force issues onto the table right now. And so part of the role of the left also is to make sure that our representatives in the halls of power are doing their due diligence to force things onto the table, to have open conflict with the establishment in winning a very robust set of reforms that working people, desperately need in the next, year, but far beyond that as well.
Thank you so much, Keely. I think this is really, really important, like a really important call to action for people in the US, but also generally around the world, because these issues are not exclusively US issues. Obviously, Trump's defeat has made like huge impact on everyone around the world, and I think like him winning made a huge impact on the far right movement around the world. Him losing is also having a huge impact on that too. So we have to organize, and that is what we're doing here. I want to encourage everyone who's listening to, especially in the US, but not only, to contact your local International Socialist Alternative branch and join us in this fight on the street. Because that is what we're trying to do. So thank you so much, Keely. This was so interesting to hear, and I'm sure we'll have you back on the show as soon as possible, because this is going to be an interesting year.